The forgotten conflict and forgotten people of Yemen, their suffering has only increased during the Saudi-led war against Houthi rebels. Millions are facing famine, disease and widespread shortages. What will it take for the international community to stop the barrage of bullets and bombs? This is Inside Story. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. This is Inside Story from Doha. They are suffering the world's largest humanitarian crisis caused by almost 3 years of civil war, with seemingly no end in sight to the hardship for millions of Yemenis. The proxy conflict is between the region's strongest powers, Iran and Saudi Arabia, along with its allies. The UN says it's alarmed by the recent rise in fighting. At least 85,000 Yemenis have been forced from their homes in the past 2 months. Yemenis are fleeing their homes on a daily basis from towns and cities such as Hodeidah and Taiz. More than 2 million are displaced. Others are trapped by airstrikes, usually without access to basic supplies. Let's bring in our panel. From Sana'a, Hakim Al-Masmari, the editor of the Yemen Post. From Beirut, Adam Baron, visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And also from Sana'a, Shabia Mantu, a spokeswoman for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Welcome to you all. Let me start by asking Ms. Mantu this. We're talking about the worst humanitarian crisis the international community is dealing with, but it seems that this is getting even worse. Give us an idea about how you're coping with this situation, given the limited resources you have and the ongoing violence.
Well, as you rightly said, we're dealing with a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. We're in a situation where 22 million people out of a population of 29 million are now in need of humanitarian assistance because of the conflict. And needs are increasing every day, every month, every year. Last year, we had 19 million people in need. This year now we have 22 million people in need. So we've been saying that as long as the conflict continues, we just continue to see humanitarian needs arise. And there's a mismatch between support for the humanitarian response and the situation here on the ground. So we're starting the year with 2 million people who have been displaced as a result of almost 3 years of war. And we're also having to respond to the needs of about 85,000 people that have been displaced in the past 10 weeks alone. And yet for us, we're starting the year with just 3% of funds available for our humanitarian response in Yemen. So there's a huge mismatch between the situation on the ground and support for the humanitarian response in Yemen.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Masmari, for the millions of Yemenis trapped in their own country, dealing on a daily basis with danger, with famine, with disease, with violence, how do they see the situation? How are they trying to deal with it?
Hopeless, Hashem. Millions of families right now are now hopeless in Sana'a and in Yemen. It's very sad when you see families, entire families, digging through garbage cans every day, every hour, in every corner. So it's heartbreaking to see these families and these children who are dying from hunger. And the world is silent. So right now people are very hopeless because of the international community has basically forgotten the Yemeni crisis. And the little aid that is coming into Yemen is not enough for even 10% of those who are suffering, let alone the inflation, the price hikes in prices for the food goods, the siege on Yemen right now, the airport being closed for almost 16 months, mm-hmm. No airports, no food, no aid, and in the end, airstrikes coming down, mainly killing civilians. As of now, at least 13,000 civilians have paid the price of this dirty war in Yemen, and the world is basically giving a blind eye to these civilians who have nothing or have no problem, only that they were stuck in a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran and fought in Yemen.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Baron, you name any case in Yemen and it's in superlatives. Cholera outbreak, the worst. The catastrophe, humanitarian catastrophe, it is the worst. Yet, it bears the question why the international community is not doing enough to stop what's going on.
I think a key aspect of this has just been that the international community has not really viewed Yemen as a priority over the past few years. You've seen it consistently shelved for other crises, particularly in the region, that are seen as more pressing. So, you see, for good reason, obviously, Syria pushing Yemen out of the headlines, Iraq pushing Yemen out of the headlines, even Libya and Egypt to an extent pushing Yemen out of the headlines. And let's face it, Yemen doesn't have the strong networks, the strong activist diaspora, et cetera, that other countries in the region do have. So in a way, if you look diplomatically, even if there is extremely positive humanitarian activity continuing in Yemen, it's not enough, because unless you have the attention being taken on the political track, when you have the numbers, 80% of Yemenis in need of food, even the greatest of humanitarian aid efforts will be insufficient.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Mantu, there's a recent outbreak of violence in the southern part of Yemen. There's also a push by government forces to take over areas in Hodeidah, in Jouf, and also in Sada. We're talking about a situation where the potential for mass exodus is there, where we might see more problems for international aid agencies in the near future. Do you have any contingency plans for those areas?
Well, we're seeing that as a result of conflict all across the country. People are fleeing from various regions all across north, east, south, and west. People are fleeing, as you mentioned, from the border governorates in Al-Jouf and Hajar. They're fleeing from the west coast in Hodeidah and Taiz, and they're also fleeing from the southeast in Shabwa. So people are just fleeing all over Yemen, and it just shows you that the conflict and humanitarian needs are widespread across the country. And that's why we have a situation where 22 million people are now in need of humanitarian assistance. So it's straining the humanitarian resources available to respond. And in the absence of enough support, it's very difficult to respond. And now we're having to fill in the gaps because the situation caused by conflict has resulted in a breakdown of essential state services as well. Mm-hmm. And we're also now in a situation where livelihoods are being lost. So we're seeing the situation spiral downward every year.
The UN has described the crisis in Yemen as a man-made catastrophe. It says 22 million Yemenis nationwide are in need, but aid is only trickling in. The Saudi blockade on Yemen's sea, land and airports has made it difficult for help to arrive. Saudi Arabia has said it's lifted the restrictions. Famine is a major threat, with 17 million people without enough food or water. And Yemenis suffer the world's worst outbreak of cholera. Diphtheria is another concern, and there's not enough medicine to treat the sick. Many hospitals and health clinics have been bombed. The UN's children's agency, UNICEF, says 5 children on average have been killed or injured every day for the past 3 years. Mr. Al-Masmari, Yemenis, when they debate the conflict, who they blame for the atrocities and this humanitarian price they had to pay? Is it the Saudi-led coalition or the Yemeni factions themselves, because they are the ones that initially triggered this conflict?
The blaming phase, Hashem, has passed in Yemen. People are just trying to survive and not die. Yes, they are blamed on all sides, all the sides of the conflict, whether the Saudi-led coalition, whether the Houthi allies, are all in charge of not reaching a political deal in Yemen. And this is why the millions of civilians are paying the price. It's not time to blame sides right now. It's time for the international community to put an end to this war that's only putting more sufferings on the civilians. The Houthis are not suffering. The Saudi is suffering financially, but they are willing to continue long term. So the only side that's suffering right now are these civilians. And as your guest said before, those who are displaced right now are nationwide. Where do you go from a dead zone to another dead zone? Even if you are displaced and you go to another area, you are also fearing death or hunger. And sometimes dying is easier for families than starving to death or seeing their children starve to death. As of right now, over the last 400 days, no media outlet has been allowed to enter Yemen. This is one of the main reasons why Yemen is a forgotten war. 400 days, no international media allowed in Yemen due to a coalition-imposed media siege on Yemen. So this is playing a major role for not giving the real picture of what's happening in Yemen to the international community.
Mr. Barron, almost 7 years ago, Yemenis took to the streets with high hopes that their uprising would lead to new, vibrant, democratic Yemen and put an end to autocracy. 7 years later, it's absolute nightmare. scenario for the Yemenis and for the international community. Do you believe that the UN and the international community can help bring about a peace-building scenario for Yemen?
I mean, I think at this point there's almost no other option. I think if you look at the situation on the ground, whether we're speaking of any of the various parties, particularly, if we're speaking of the Houthis and their allies, or for that matter, elements allied to the government, absent pressure, this conflict will continue. You've reached a situation where you have this almost, despite the fact that these sides are fighting each other, a coexistence among key warlords who are all, ironically making money out of the conflict as, the Yemeni people are starving to death. So I think what you do need is some sort of concerted international effort, taking into consideration the concerns of the coalition, obviously, but to sort of broker some sort of realistic peace deal that could end the conflict in some regard. Because unfortunately, I think when you look at the numbers that Yemen is seeing, when you look at the scale of the humanitarian crisis, any humanitarian steps are just going to be a drop in the bucket. That's not to say that they're not positive and needed. And if you look, for example, at the new plan that the coalition had put out, increasing humanitarian access, that's absolutely a tremendous step. That being said, as long as you continue to have these sort of blockages imposed by various warring parties and factions on Yemen, trade, and its economy, you're going to continue to see a situation where the numbers of impoverished Yemenis will remain high despite any level of humanitarian aid.
Ms. Manto, the UNSF says that Yemen is one of the worst places in the world to be a child. More than 500,000 children are affected by cholera. We're talking about also malnutrition. I mean, when you look at this particular situation, what is your concern if the conflict continues over the next months?
Well, the travesty in what's happening in Yemen is that it's innocent people, innocent men, women, and children who are not partaking in the conflict. They're the ones paying the highest price. It's civilians who are suffering. They're being injured. They're being killed. They're suffering from preventable diseases, from cholera, from malnutrition. We're seeing all this arise as a consequence of the conflict. So we will see the situation, as long as the conflict continues, the situation for civilians, for children, for women, for people who are particularly vulnerable, for people who've had to flee their homes, it will get worse. And we're very concerned. We're very concerned because we're going to see a situation where the majority of the population will be in need of aid, and those innocent civilians are the ones that are suffering and paying the highest price.
In January, the Saudi government said it would commit $1.5 billion in new aid to Yemen.
We spent or supported this, the Yemen with almost $1 billion, during the last 3 years, in the form of food security and health security. As you see, this camp, there are more than 15 camps in Marib only, in addition to the other areas in other parts of Yemen.
Mr. Al-Masmari, the Saudis are saying that they will commit $1.5 billion of humanitarian aid to Yemen. What do you think should come first, aid or an immediate end to the fighting?
The aid is useless if civilians continue to die. What's the use of aid or financial help if they're bombarding Yemen day and night? So the goal right now is to end the war. It's very worrying and very sad to see that the international community and the UN in specific has done basically nothing over the last 300 days, almost 11 months, doing no peace talks, no mediations or no negotiations. This has led to a long stalemate in Yemen peace talks. Now, as a result, next month you have a new UN envoy who will start from zero. So it's basically prolonging the sufferings of these innocent civilians. And over the last 18 months, no side has been able to gain ground, only limited gains here and there. But overall, no sides have gained serious ground over the last 18 months, which shows that there's no way to end this war militarily. It must happen soon before thousands of civilians continue to die from hunger and malnutrition before it's too late.
Mr. Barron, I mean, the Saudi-led coalition is saying that it's committed to helping the Yemenis in terms of humanitarian needs. But at the same time, if the airstrikes continue, with the same scope that we're seeing, isn't this something that which is likely just to further aggravate the situation for the millions of Yemenis?
I mean, I think it's difficult to sort of point fingers. In a way, there are so many fingers to point here. And you know, the continuing airstrikes and military offensives on the one hand are not positive, but let's not forget the Houthis are besieging the city of Taiz. Just yesterday, Houthi shelling killed a prominent female lawyer there. You know, let's not forget that even though it is much more difficult for journalists to enter the country, although it would be false to say that journalists have not been entering the country over the past 150 days. There was just there have been 2 significant press delegations to Madab just over the past 4 months. But even if this is being difficult due to coalition measures, let's not forget that the Houthis are also locking up journalists and civil society activists, you know, left and right. So I think part of what's necessary is taking a sober-minded look at, you know, at what effectively is going on, and recognizing that no one side is going to emerge victorious in this conflict, number one. And number two, that the longer this war continues, many of the worst elements within Yemen, and we're talking black market activists, black market actors, weapons smugglers, etc., will continue to be enriched, which will make any sort of post-conflict settlement all the more difficult. Which comes down to the fact that humanitarian aid is great, it's fantastic, and efforts to increase humanitarian aid are laudable. But absent some sort of larger plan and strategy and, you know, agenda to deepen efforts to resolve the conflict in Yemen, any humanitarian aid will ultimately and unfortunately be insufficient. What Yemen needs more than anything is not, you know, more aid. What it needs is peace.
Peace and aid. Ms. Manto, I mean,
quite far out.
There are people who are desperate for treatment, and they can't afford to go to places to get their medicine. They're so scared sometimes to move from their own villages. Sometimes you and most of the aid agencies have to negotiate deals to be allowed safe passage into areas. I mean, against the backdrop of this very complex political security situation, I mean, what's next for you? I mean, what is your plan for tomorrow if everything continues the same?
Well, every year it's getting worse, and really our appeal is twofold. Number one, there needs to be a stopgap on these humanitarian needs accruing, and the only way for that is really for a peaceful political solution, because in the absence of peace, no matter how much we respond on the ground, it will be futile if we continue to see more and more people in need every day, more and more people fleeing their homes, more and more people dying from preventable causes. So we really need a peaceful political solution that has to be imminent. At the same time, we need also support, because we're exhausted here. We don't have enough support for the humanitarian response, and we can't then reach enough people. We can't really impact and save lives as we could. So we need more support for the humanitarian response, and we need the international community really to step up and try and facilitate peace here. We need an end to the conflict. That's the only way that's really going to stop humanitarian needs.
Mr. Al-Masmari, in 2011, hope was that Yemen would be united, vibrant democracy where people could enjoy more transparency. Now we're talking about different reality. The Houthis control the north. The secessionists now seem to have the upper hand in the southern part of the country. Places like Taiz are divided. The Houthis on one hand and the internationally recognized government of Hadi on the other hand. Are we talking about a Yemen which is likely to become a fragmented nation?
Yemen will never return to how it was, Hashem. And the millions in Yemen don't care who controls the territory, whether it's the allies of the Houthis or the allies of the Hadi government. Who's giving more to the people? Who's helping the people? The scariest thing about this war is that the war violations have become normal, that even international media are giving it less attention because it's happening on a daily basis from both sides, from both classic sides. So this is the scary part. And even those who are killing the civilians are also not giving more attention because they know that there's less eyes looking at them. And that's why these violations are continuing. Yemen, 2-3 years from now, even if there is peace, how will these millions of people stand up on their feet again after this disastrous war that had them lose everything, lost loved ones, hundreds of thousands of homes, of families have left their homes, displaced, sold everything they owned, the extreme poverty line that they reached. So it would take years and years even after the end of this war. But it's important to end this war right now, and the UN has to play a strong role. And also negatively in Sana'a, it's sadly that the Houthis in Sana'a are also giving the UN a hard time sometimes, in distributing the aid. So also both sides need to cooperate and need to open the doors for each other. Understand that, keep the civilians away from this.
Yes, but then again,
war amongst yourselves and let the civilians at least
but then
a chance
again,
to
let
live.
me go to Mr. Barron. Where would you pick up? I mean, if you were to ask all the parties to negotiate a settlement, would you go back to the time of the transitional period in 2013-14? Would you start from where the Houthis took over the capital in 2014? Because we seem to have a fast-moving political reality, and every day is just a new story, a new narrative in Yemen.
Oh, indeed. And I think that's a huge challenge facing the UN and other parties as they attempt to mediate the conflict. Yemen today is not Yemen as it was in 2011. It's not how it was when the Houthis took over in 2014. Even the past year, we've seen extremely significant political changes. The emergence of new actors, for example, the Southern Transitional Council. The reshifting of regional dynamics. For example, the city of Madab emerging as a key population and economic center for the first time since, roughly 2 millennia. So that's a real question moving forward. It's not just a matter when you have, key actors like the UN, the international community sitting down and trying to source Yemen out at this point. It's not just a matter of how do we end this war. It's also a matter of how do we acknowledge and take into account the new political, social, and economic realities that have emerged over the past 2 or 3 years. And that's really part of the key challenge. And it's not something that's, I don't think, getting enough discussion.
Ms. Mantu, I mean, if you look at the figures of the international aid agencies, it just really portray a horrific reality on the ground. This is one of the poorest nations on earth. 70%, almost 80% of the children and the families live below the poverty line. 16 million Yemenis need humanitarian assistance. We're talking about one of the places where the potential for more explosive conflicts are likely to continue in the coming days and weeks. I mean, what is your next move for the humanitarian relief work in Yemen?
Well, because of the sheer number of needs, with 22 million people affected by conflict and in need, we've had to prioritize assistance to those most vulnerable. And so we're trying to reach those who are particularly vulnerable, people who've had to flee their homes, people who are really at a heightened risk of further harm. So it's not an easy choice, but obviously in a situation like this where we're overwhelmed with this sheer scale of suffering and also the lack of adequate support from the international community to respond to the crisis, then we have to prioritize aid. But really now, as you've said rightly at the start of this program, we've seen 85,000 people displaced in just the past few weeks alone. So our priority is really being able to assist those who are continuing to flee their home as a result of intensified violence across the country. They're fleeing their homes, as your other guests have said, with nothing, absolutely no possessions, nowhere to go, nowhere in Yemen is particularly safe, so they may end up fleeing to another location. Again, there, they will have to flee again. So we're trying to reach those who are really, traumatized, distressed, really in need, facing very horrific circumstances through no fault of their own. So our priority is really just ensuring emergency assistance for those around the country.
Let's just hope that the sufferings of the Yemenis come to an end very, very soon. Ms. Mantu, Mr. Masmari, Mr. Barron, thank you very much indeed for your presence and for your contribution to the show. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.